For decades, the German High Command, the most respected and feared military mind in the world, studied America. They read our journals, they watched our men train, and they came to one simple conclusion. We were a nation of soft, undisciplined shopkeepers. They believed we were not, and could never be, true soldiers. They were fatally wrong. And the story of exactly how they discovered their mistake, the specific moments that shattered their worldview, is a lesson in American grit that every one of us should know. It's easy to look back now, with the clarity of history, and call it arrogance. And perhaps it was. But in 1941, their assessment wasn't just cynical. It was, by all European standards, entirely logical. The German officer corps was the product of centuries of Prussian military tradition, a system that prized iron discipline, sacrifice, and a deep, almost spiritual understanding of warfare as an art. They looked across the Atlantic at America and saw a nation they simply didn't recognize from a military perspective. They saw a people obsessed with comfort, with individualism, with profit. A nation that hadn't fought a major war on its own soil since the 1860s, and seemed to them to have forgotten how. What they saw in our military only confirmed their biases. In 1941, as Hitler was unleashing the largest and most brutal invasion in human history against the Soviet Union, the United States Army was frankly a bit of a joke. It numbered about 1.6 million men. To put that in perspective, that's barely larger than the Army of Portugal at the time. Our tanks were often obsolete, thin-skinned machines that would have been coffins on a European battlefield. Our officers, many of them fine and decent men, hadn't seen a real fight since 1918, a full generation ago. In military terms, the Germans, by contrast, were the undisputed masters of the world. They had crushed Poland in a matter of weeks. They had humiliated France, a nation with a proud military history and a massive army, in just 6 weeks. As 1941 drew to a close, their armies were at the very gates of Moscow. They had rewritten the rules of war with their blitzkrieg, the lightning war. So when the news of Pearl Harbor shattered the peace on December 7th, and America was suddenly, violently thrust into the global conflict, the German planners in Berlin did their sums. They added this new enemy to their global chessboard and concluded it changed almost nothing. In their minds, the war would be over long before America could ever matter. They estimated it would take us, at a bare minimum, 2 to 3 years to raise, train, equip, and, most importantly, transport a meaningful army across the vast Atlantic Ocean. By then, they reasoned, Russia would be broken, Britain would be starved into submission by their U-boats, and the war in Europe would be decided. Germany would be the unassailable fuster of a fortress, stretching from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. This was perhaps the single greatest miscalculation in modern history, and the German realization that they were not fighting the America they had studied, but an entirely different and more terrifying kind of enemy, didn't happen all at once. It came in a series of powerful, world-shaking shocks. Shocks that began not with the thunder of guns, but with the quiet scratching of a pen on a piece of paper, in an intelligence office in Berlin. The very first cracks in Germany's confidence came from their own analysts. These were meticulous, professional men, sitting in dark offices, staring at reports from agents in America, at shipping manifests, at radio intercepts, at public economic data. And the numbers they were seeing, they just couldn't be right. They checked their math again and again. These had to be propaganda. Bluster, the typical American bravado. They were reading reports that American shipyards, yards that had been half dormant just a few years before, were now building cargo ships, the famous Liberty ships, at a rate that defied physics and all known industrial practice. They weren't just building them in the traditional sense. They were assembling them like a child's model kit. Men like Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built a ship in his life, were applying American mass production techniques, welding entire hulls in massive prefabricated sections. A ship that used to take a European yard half a year to build was now sliding into the water in less than 2 months. Then it became 1 month. Then, in one famous case, a ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built, from its first keel plate to its launch, in 4 days and 15 hours. The German U-boat wolf packs were sinking Allied ships at a horrifying, unsustainable rate. It was their single best hope of defeating Great Britain. But the analysts in Berlin did the new math, and their blood ran cold. America was already launching ships faster than the entire German U-boat fleet, at the height of its success, could possibly sink them. The vital lifeline to Britain wasn't just holding. It was getting stronger every single day. And if that wasn't enough to cause concern, the reports from the skies were even worse. American aircraft factories, places like Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, a single factory a mile long, were churning out heavy bombers as if they were Model Ts. The Germans were told that America was producing more B-24 Liberator bombers in a single month than Germany's entire annual output of all heavy bombers combined. It was fantasy. It was simply impossible. Germany, after all, had the most advanced and efficient industrial economy in Europe, one that had been meticulously organized for total war since 1939. And yet these reports insisted that America, while fighting a two-ocean war and supplying Britain and Russia, was still outproducing the Third Reich by a factor of 3 or 4, and in some critical categories, 5 to 1. And then there were the tanks. The Germans loved their tanks. Their panzers were their armored knights, masterpieces of engineering, built by skilled craftsmen with a kind of lethal artistry. The American approach was different. They were building M4 Sherman tanks on an automobile assembly line, treating them not as artisan weapons, but as simple, rugged, replaceable tools. The numbers were fantastical. 10,000, 20,000. By the end of the war, over 50,000 Sherman tanks. The German planners checked, rechecked, and finally, with a growing sense of dread, had to confirm the numbers were real. America wasn't just building an army. It was building an avalanche of steel. This was disturbing, deeply disturbing. The mathematical implications were unavoidable. War, after all, is a brutal equation of men and material. But the German High Command held on to one crucial belief, a belief that had served them well for a century. Material is not everything. You can give a shopkeeper the finest rifle in the world, but that doesn't make him a soldier. You can give him a tank, but it doesn't make him a tanker. The real test, the only test that truly mattered, would come on the battlefield. And in the dusty, sun-baked hills of North Africa, in early 1943, it looked for a horrifying moment, like the Germans were absolutely right. The first major clash between German and American ground troops in the European theater was a disaster for the United States. At Kasserine Pass, in the rugged mountains of Tunisia, the green, untested American forces ran headlong into the hardened, sun-baked veterans of Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps. The result was a rout, a humiliation. The Americans were poorly led. Their units broke and ran, and they left behind a staggering, embarrassing amount of brand-new equipment. German soldiers picking over the abandoned American tanks, guns, and trucks felt their confidence surge. This was the enemy they had expected. Soft, clumsy, poorly trained, and lacking the will to fight. German veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad and the massive, grinding tank battles, found this new enemy almost laughable. The Russians were something else entirely. They were, in the German view, fanatics, almost subhuman in their willingness to die. They would charge directly into machine gun fire. They accepted horrific, unimaginable casualties, and they just kept coming, a seemingly endless tide of humanity. The Americans, by contrast, seemed overly cautious. They were, as one captured German report famously put it, lacking in fanatical determination. So the German High Command settled on a new, comfortable assumption. Yes, the Americans had a lot of stuff, an absurd amount of stuff. But that stuff would be squandered by poorly trained soldiers and clumsy amateur officers. The German soldat, the professional fighting man, with his superior training, his tactical excellence, and his battle-hardened courage would easily offset the American material advantage. Quality, they believed, and their entire military doctrine was based on it, would always beat quantity. This assumption held, more or less, through the tough, grinding, bloody fight up the boot of Italy. American forces were learning. Yes, they were getting better, tougher. They were demonstrating a disturbing, un-German-like ability to learn from their mistakes and adapt their tactics on the fly. But the fighting was slow, it was costly, and the Germans were masters of defense. It was a fair fight. This comfortable belief, this last pillar of German strategic confidence, held firm all the way until the gray, overcast morning of June 6, 1944. And in the days that followed, it wasn't just cracked, it was vaporized. The true, earth-shattering revelation of what America had become didn't happen on the beaches of Omaha, though that was a story of grim, unbelievable courage that we all know and honor. No, the real shock, the one that broke the German military mind, came in the days after the landing as German commanders in their bunkers tried to understand what, exactly, they were now facing. The scale of the invasion fleet itself was a marvel. Over 5,000 ships. An armada so vast it choked the English Channel. An operation of logistical coordination that no military in history had ever even attempted, let alone pulled off. But again, scale alone could be explained by America's factories. What truly broke the German commanders, what made them realize the war was lost, was not the scale. It was the philosophy. It was the systematic, almost casual, and utterly brutal application of industrial power to solve every single military problem. Let me paint you a picture of what a German commander, a veteran of France and Russia, saw in the hedgerow country of Normandy. In the European way of war, artillery was a precious, almost surgical instrument. You husbanded your shells. You fired for effect at specific high-value targets. You carefully calculated your supply because you knew that every shell fired was one less Johann had for the next battle. The Americans operated under a completely different, and to the Germans, an insane set of rules. When an American infantry platoon, moving through those thick ancient hedgerows, ran into a single, well-hidden German machine gun nest, they didn't do what a German or Russian platoon would do. They didn't try to outflank it. They didn't launch a brave, costly frontal assault. No, the American platoon leader, a 22-year-old lieutenant who might have been selling insurance a year earlier, got on his radio. First, he would call for his own company's mortars. If that didn't silence the gun, he'd call the battalion's heavy mortars. If the machine gun was still firing, he'd get on the radio to divisional artillery. And within minutes, an entire battery of 105mm howitzers, maybe 12 guns, would unleash a furious barrage, firing more shells in 10 minutes than a German division might receive in an entire week. If the target was still a problem, the call would go out for air support, and a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts, Jabos, as the Germans called them, would appear, loaded with 500-pound bombs and rockets. And if they were anywhere near the coast, they'd even call in naval gunfire from a battleship or a cruiser sitting offshore, firing shells the size of a small car. Shells that didn't just explode. They erased the landscape. Only after the offending hedgerow had been physically obliterated from the face of the earth, reduced to smoking firewood and craters, would the American infantry get up and cautiously advance to the next hedgerow. To the German officers watching this, it was baffling, it was bewildering, it seemed cowardly. It seemed, more than anything, wasteful. They saw it as absolute proof that the American soldier lacked the basic infantry skills, the stormtrooper spirit, the courage to close with and destroy the enemy. But they also saw, with growing horror, that it was devastatingly, undeniably effective. American forces were grinding forward, slowly, yes, but inexorably, and they were taking far fewer casualties than a comparable German operation would have cost. And the German defenders, the master race of soldiers, they were being systematically annihilated, running out of ammunition, running out of men, with no replacements in sight. This was the core, fundamental difference. German logistics, a system honed to perfection by the Prussian General Staff, was based on sufficiency. You calculated the minimum supplies needed for an operation and delivered them with maximum efficiency. Waste was the ultimate sin. American logistics, by contrast, was built on abundance and redundancy. The American quartermaster's goal was not to prevent waste. His goal was to prevent any possibility, however remote, of a shortage. German intelligence officers who captured American supply dumps sent back reports that their superiors in Berlin literally refused to believe. They thought the officers had gone mad. They described literal mountains of ammunition crates, oceans of fuel barrels, acres of spares, tires, engines, crates of food, uniforms, chocolate, and cigarettes, all just sitting there, often uncovered, in the rain. It seemed to violate every principle of military efficiency. But what it meant was that American units never stopped. They could operate at full intensity, 24 hours a day, indefinitely. They could afford to fire 10,000 artillery shells at a single stubborn crossroads, because it simply didn't matter. There were, quite literally, millions more shells on the way. But even the staggering shock of American firepower paled in comparison to another, even more profound difference. A difference that spoke to the very heart of the 20th century, and a truth that the Germans learned far too late. That difference was mechanization. The German army of 1944, the mighty Wehrmacht, the very pioneers of the Lightning War, still moved mostly on foot. It's one of the great illusions of history, one that old newsreels helped create. We see the footage of the panzer divisions, the tanks and the half-tracks, and we assume the whole army was like that. The truth is, the vast majority of the German army was a 19th century force. Their supplies, their artillery, their food, all of it was pulled by horses. Hundreds of thousands of horses. Only their elite divisions, the Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units, were fully motorized. And even they were a desperate hodgepodge of captured French, Czech, and Russian trucks, constantly starved for the two things an engine needs: fuel and spare parts. In all of France, the German army in the West could scrape together perhaps 2,000 operational tanks, and each one was a precious, almost irreplaceable asset. Now consider the American army that landed in Normandy. By late summer of 1944, they had deployed over 10,000 tanks, with more arriving on every single ship. But that wasn't even the real difference. The real difference was the humble truck. In the entire American army, from the division headquarters down to the rifle company, there was not a single horse, not one. Every unit was fully, 100% motorized, with standardized brand new vehicles. The ubiquitous deuce and a half, truck, the Jeep, the half-track. And the operational consequence of this was staggering. It's what truly sealed Germany's fate. When a German division needed to move 100 miles to plug a gap in the line, they marched. It took them 3, maybe 4 days. They arrived on the front lines exhausted, their feet bloody, their horses spent. They needed to rest before they could even be considered combat effective. When an American division commander got an order to move 100 miles, he told his men to get in their trucks, and they drove. They arrived at the new front in 6 hours, fresh, fully supplied, and ready for combat immediately. This mobility differential meant the Americans could concentrate force faster, exploit breakthroughs with terrifying speed, and sustain an operational tempo that the German army, with its 19th century logistical tale, simply could not match. The German generals, the inheritors of Clausewitz, were playing a game of checkers, while the Americans were playing a new game entirely, a game played at the speed of the internal combustion engine. The moment this all came to a head, the day the German generals truly understood the game was over, was during Operation Cobra in late July 1944. This was the American breakout from the confines of Normandy. It wasn't just a battle. It was an industrial process of destruction. The Americans concentrated an overwhelming force, thousands of guns, on a tiny, narrow sector of the front. Then they unleashed thousands of heavy and medium bombers to carpet bomb that sector, literally blowing the German defensive division, the elite Panzer Lehr, one of their best, off the map. It was said that men who survived were found, days later, miles away, wandering in a daze, unable to speak. Then through the gap poured the armored divisions of General George S. Patton, and they didn't advance cautiously the way they had in the hedgerows. They advanced at maximum speed. They didn't stop to fight strong points. They bypassed them, leaving them for the infantry and air power. To clean up later, they drove deep, 50, 60 miles in a single day, into the German rear, cutting supply lines, overrunning headquarters, and shattering the entire German position in France. The German response was what they had always done. They tried to organize a counterattack, but it was hopeless. When their panzer divisions tried to assemble for their classic, brilliant tactical maneuver, American fighter bombers, directed by radio from observers on the ground, descended like hawks and tore their columns apart before they even reached the battle. When German commanders tried to coordinate a new defensive line, American signals intelligence, thanks to the code breakers at Bletchley Park and in Washington, intercepted their messages, and Allied commanders often knew their plans before their own troops did. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, the commander of German forces in France, began sending frantic, desperate reports back to Hitler in Berlin. He described a situation that was not just a defeat, but a disintegration. His forces were being systematically destroyed, not in grand, glorious battles, but by a relentless, grinding, 24-hour-a-day attrition. He explained, in stark, unforgiving terms, that every engagement, even a local victory, resulted in a net loss for Germany. Every time his men bravely held a position, they expended irreplaceable ammunition. Every time they were forced to retreat, they had to abandon priceless equipment, tanks and artillery, that they simply could not replace. Von Kluge's reports are fascinating, because he insists, almost to the end, that his men are fighting well. His officers are tactically brilliant. His defenses are professional. And he was right. They were some of the best soldiers in the world. But he concluded, none of it mattered. He was facing an enemy that could simply keep attacking, keep applying pressure, keep grinding, until the superior German soldier finally collapsed from sheer, utter exhaustion and depletion. The machine, the American machine, had come to collect. What followed in August of 1944 was the Great Pursuit across France, a chapter of the war that's often overlooked. This phase demonstrated American capabilities that truly seemed to violate the laws of physics, as the Germans understood them. Patton's Third Army advanced hundreds of miles in just a few days, a spearhead of armor and motorized infantry that seemed to be operating completely independent of any supply lines. In reality, it was quite the opposite. This advance was sustained by the single greatest logistical achievement of the war, the Red Ball Express, with the French rail network completely destroyed by Allied bombers and the French resistance. The Allies created a massive one-way highway loop, thousands upon thousands of trucks, driven 24 hours a day and night, in a never-ending convoy, often by African-American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, heroes who have seldom gotten their due. Racing from the Normandy beaches to the front lines, they delivered thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food every single day, allowing the advance to continue at a pace the Germans, with their horse-drawn wagons, could not even comprehend, let alone match. German commanders would set up what they thought was a strong defensive position along a river, like the Seine, believing it would take the Americans weeks to assemble the forces and the heavy bridging equipment to force a crossing. They would wake up the next morning to find that American combat engineers, working under fire, had already thrown a pontoon bridge across the river overnight, and that an entire American armored division was already in their rear, cutting them off the speed, the scale, the relentless 24-hour nature of American operations. It suggested an army that had somehow conquered the basic, fundamental limitations of friction, fatigue, and logistics that had defined warfare for all of human history. It was around this time that German intelligence officers, desperate to understand what they were up against, began to analyze captured American field manuals. And what they found baffled them completely. American doctrine assumed a level of material consumption that German doctrine considered wildly, catastrophically unsustainable. American planners, for example, calculated their ammunition requirements for an offensive at 2 or even 3 times the rate that German planners considered a maximum sustainable level. American logistics manuals specified storage levels for supplies that German quartermasters would have been court-martialed for, seeing them as criminally wasteful. Even their philosophies on people and equipment were alien. The German army prized the experienced lancer, the veteran, who had been with his unit for years and knew it inside and out. They also had master mechanics who could, with skill and ingenuity, repair a damaged tank on the battlefield. The American system was more industrial. It treated its soldiers and its equipment as replaceable parts. When a tank's engine broke down, they often didn't repair it in the field. They pulled the whole engine out, dropped a new one in, and sent the broken one back to a massive depot to be rebuilt. They rotated combat veterans back to the United States to train new recruits and fed fresh individual replacements into frontline units. This often broke up the small unit cohesion that German commanders prized, but it also meant that American units were always being replenished. They never stayed depleted for long. The system was designed to maintain combat power at a steady, sustainable level, just like a factory production line. Every single American practice, from tactics to training to logistics, seemed to fly in the face of German assumptions about military efficiency and tradition. But the cumulative effect was an army that could sustain a level of high-intensity combat indefinitely. A German division, after a major offensive, was spent. It was a husk. It needed weeks, sometimes months, to be pulled out of the line, refitted, and rearmed. An American division, after a major costly battle, would be pulled off the line, refilled with new men and new tanks from the endless supply pipeline, and be ready to fight again in a matter of days. The question that tormented the German High Command in the fall of 1944 was a grim one. Were they facing a temporary advantage, one that German skill and fighting spirit could eventually overcome? Or was this a fundamental disparity, a difference in the very nature of the two nations, that made defeat absolutely inevitable, regardless of what their soldiers did on the field? Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most respected and experienced officers, was recalled from retirement to command in the West. He was an old-school Prussian aristocrat. He looked at the maps, he read the reports from the front, and he concluded, with the cold pessimism of his class, that the latter was true. He assessed that American material superiority was so total, so overwhelming, that German tactical brilliance was now irrelevant. It could win local skirmishes. It could delay the Americans for a day or a week, but it could not affect the operational outcome. Every German victory, he noted, cost them irreplaceable men and panzers. Every American defeat was just a temporary setback, a line item in their budget, erased within weeks by their massive replacement system. The math, he concluded, was inexorable. The German army was being ground down to nothing, while the American army just kept getting stronger. There was one last desperate attempt to prove that old-world military genius and fighting spirit could still defeat New World industrial might, the Ardennes Offensive. What we know as the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, it was Hitler's last great gamble. He secretly and brilliantly assembled Germany's last operational reserves, gambling everything on a single, massive punch. The plan was classic German operational art: attack during a massive snowstorm that would ground the all-powerful Allied air forces, achieve total surprise, and use their concentrated heavy armor to split the American and British lines. Their goal was to drive for the port of Antwerp, cutting off the Allied armies in the north, and forcing a negotiated peace. And at first, it worked. The shock was total. The attack ripped a massive bulge in the American lines, surrounding entire units and capturing thousands of prisoners. For a few frantic, freezing days, it looked like the German army of 1940 was back. But then the American difference showed itself again, and in a way that sealed Germany's fate for good. The German plan assumed the Americans would react like the French in 1940, that they would panic, that their lines would collapse, that their command structure would freeze. Unsure of what to do, they were wrong. The surrounded American units, most famously the 101st Airborne, at the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, were told to surrender. Their commander's reply became an American legend. Nuts! They just held on, cut off, outnumbered, freezing in foxholes with limited ammunition. They simply refused to break. And then the American logistical and mechanical beast roared to life, in a move that German planners had simply not believed possible. The Americans redirected entire armies to converge on the threatened sector. General Patton's Third Army, which was 90 miles to the south, and preparing for its own offensive in a completely different direction, was ordered to turn 90 degrees and attack north to relieve Bastogne. His staff said it was impossible, that it would take at least a week to replan the logistics and move the troops. Patton famously told them they had 48 hours. His men got in their trucks, drove day and night on icy, treacherous roads, and smashed into the German flank, arriving with a speed that defied all European military logic. And when the weather finally cleared, the skies filled with American and British aircraft, they didn't just attack the German front lines. They annihilated their supply columns. The elite German panzers, which had advanced so brilliantly, slowly, painfully ground to a halt, out of fuel. The offensive, which had cost Germany its last reserves of men, armor, and fuel, achieved nothing. And here, in the failure of the Bulge, was the final, brutal lesson for the German High Command. When Germany lost those elite panzer divisions in the Ardennes, they were gone forever. The factories were bombed, rubble. The fuel was gone. The experienced crews were dead or captured. The replacements simply did not exist. When America suffered heavy, grievous losses, those losses were replaced within weeks. The replacement system, that vast industrial pipeline of men and materiel stretching 3,000 miles back to Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles, just kept flowing. A German tactical victory might destroy an American division, but that division would be rebuilt and back in the fight a month later. An American tactical victory destroyed a German division, and that division was erased from the map permanently. It was a war of attrition, and that is a war you cannot win against an opponent who has, for all practical purposes, unlimited resources and the will to use them. In the aftermath, captured German soldiers and their letters home revealed a strange, bitter respect for their new enemy. They still believed, often to the very end, that they were the better soldiers, man for man. Their after-action reports, which we can read today, are filled with frustration. They complained bitterly about facing an enemy who refused to fight fair, an enemy that would call down a hurricane of steel and high explosives to deal with a single machine gun. They hated that the Americans seemed to have unlimited ammunition, that they ate hot meals on the front lines, and that they replaced their casualties and losses overnight. German veterans of the Eastern Front, when transferred west, made a very telling comparison. They said fighting the Russians meant facing human waves, men who could be mowed down if your defense was good and your nerve held. But fighting the Americans, they said, meant facing a machine. It meant facing a tide of firepower that would, given enough time, always reduce your position to rubble. And the Americans, it seemed, had all the time and all the ammunition in the world. What impressed and terrified the German professional officers the most was the systematic nature of it all. The Americans approached war like an industrial problem, one to be solved with efficiency and overwhelming force. They didn't rely on centuries of martial tradition. They created competent soldiers through standardized, rapid training. They didn't rely on master craftsmen to repair their tanks in the field. They used standardized parts and simply replaced what was broken. They didn't rely on the individual, swashbuckling brilliance of a few dashing officers. They relied on relentless coordination, on teamwork, on firepower, and on a system that was designed to minimize the importance of any one man. It was an army built not for extraordinary heroes, but for ordinary men. Farmers, factory workers, clerks, and yes, shopkeepers. To do their job effectively day after day after day. It was a philosophy that offended the German military culture, which was built on martial virtue and individual excellence. But it was also the philosophy that was winning the war in the most decisive and crushing way imaginable. The final months of the war in Europe were a grim formality. The German army was collapsing, fielding children as young as 12 and old men in their 60s. The Volkssturm, or People's Storm, armed with single-shot Panzerfaust rockets and a desperate, suicidal fanaticism. America, meanwhile, was deploying fresh, brand-new divisions, equipped with the latest weapons, supported by an air force that owned the sky, and backed by a logistics system that ensured every GI was fed, armed, and supplied more lavishly than a German field marshal had been at the height of his power. The final symbolic act was the crossing of the Rhine. In March 1945, the Rhine was Germany's last great natural barrier, the sacred river of German lore, protecting the heartland. The Germans defended it with the desperation of a dying animal. The Americans crossed it like it was just another industrial problem to be solved. They unleashed artillery barrages on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before in the history of war. They constructed massive bridges under fire with an engineering speed that seemed, by European standards, to be a miracle. And within days, American armies were fanning out across Western Germany against a resistance that was no longer fighting, but simply dissolving. So, when was the day Germany learned? America was built different. It wasn't one single day. It was a cascade of realizations, a series of painful, shocking lessons. It was the intelligence analyst in Berlin, staring at shipping numbers that couldn't possibly be real. It was the veteran quartermaster in Normandy, walking through a captured American supply dump that was the size of his entire hometown. It was the frontline commander in the hedgerows, watching his best, most hardened position get vaporized by naval gunfire from a ship he couldn't even see. And ultimately, it was the field marshal, looking at the map in his bunker and realizing that the cold, hard math of attrition had already sealed his nation's fate. They learned that America had weaponized its entire economy, its very way of life, its belief in mass production and overwhelming force. They learned that our industrial system had created a new kind of warfare, one that made their traditional centuries-old measures of skill and courage almost obsolete. They were, in the end, fighting an opponent that could afford to be wasteful, that could afford to make mistakes and replace its losses, because its resources were so truly, fundamentally, and unimaginably vast. It's a story from our parents' and grandparents' generation. But it's one that speaks to the unique, powerful, and sometimes terrifying character of this nation. If you've enjoyed this look back at our history, we hope you'll join our community by subscribing.